This video is made possible by my game bundle. Play 7 awesome games and help support the channel. Get the Steam game bundle at unitycodemonkey.com/gamebundle. In this video, I'm going to talk about my indie game developer journey. How I got started making chat games 20 years ago, then moved on to Flash and eventually got to Unity. Through all that, I made over 40 games and learned a ton along the way, which I'm now sharing in these videos. Let's begin! Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey, and this channel is all about helping you learn how to make your own games with in-depth tutorials made by a professional indie game developer. So if you find the video helpful, consider subscribing. Alright, so here I will cover my entire game dev journey over these past 20 years. How I got started making chat games, then moved on to Flash, and finally to Unity. Over all that time, I've made over 40 games and learned a ton. This video took a real long time to put together with writing and editing, so if you can, please hit the like button and share it with a friend. Most of my Steam games are included in the game bundle, which you can pick up on the website. This video is made possible thanks to these awesome supporters. Go to patreon.com/unitycodemonkey to get some perks and help keep the videos free for everyone. My game dev journey started quite a very long time ago. I've been making games using Unity since 2012. Before that, I made games with Flash since 2008. And before that, I was experimenting with programming, making all kinds of games since I was about 10. I started learning programming by modding mIRC, which was a very nice and simple IRC chat client. It was a great way to get started learning the basics of programming and logic. It was mostly limited to text, but the code was real and I found it fascinating to write code to tell the machine what to do. Eventually I did a bunch of chat games like Trivia, Hangman, Guess the Number, and so on. So very simple stuff, but it was enough to get me started on the idea of interactivity. Over time, I was also interested in movies and animation, so eventually I found my way into Flash. It was the best program to draw and animate things. It was frame-by-frame animation, which is a very laborious way of animating, but also extremely intuitive. You just draw one frame, then move the character a bit in the next frame, and so on. So as I was doing that, it didn't take too long to see how I could also write code in Flash. So at that point, my brain clicked, and I realized that I could get the code and animations working together to create something amazing. Until then, I had really just mostly made text-based games, so the idea of adding some interactive visuals was insane. I immediately started to wonder, thinking about all the amazing games that I could make. The first Flash version I tried was Flash MX, and I remember my parents buying me a great book about it. I read the whole thing cover to cover and got better and better at writing code and merging it with visuals and animations. This was still back when I was a kid, at around 14-15, so I had no idea or any thought of turning this into a job. I was just making cool stuff for fun. So I kept doing things over time as my normal life went on, so constantly learning and creating. And in 2008, I randomly came across Mochi ads. This was an API that you could add to Flash in order to play an ad before the start of the game and potentially make some money. This was at the point where I started to think that maybe there was a possibility of making a job out of it. So I went right for it, learned all the basics really quickly, learned all the various websites that existed, and published my first game with the hope of making something out of it. The end result was a game called Freeway. It's a very simple car avoiding game. You have your car that you can move around, the road is infinite in a straight line, there are other cars that get randomly spawned, and there's a score being calculated. So this was the first time that I made something that I could really call a game. It had a complete, albeit simple, game design. There were sound effects and music, there were rules for winning and losing, and player input in order to control the game. So that's how I eventually got started. A very simple, very basic game. But despite being simple, it was still challenging to make since it was my first game. Now obviously, ads are a notoriously difficult way to make money. Essentially, you need millions of views in order to get a very basic, decent amount. So for that game, it made something like 50 cents in the first few days. That sounds like a meaningless amount, but for me it meant that I had found a possible path. As long as I got better at making games, then the potential to turn it into a career was right there. I just had to gain more experience and get a lot better. So I just kept at it, making many games one after the other. All of them simple, but all of them from start to finish. I learned how to draw better in Flash and manage the animations. I got better at ActionScript 2 and made more complex games. Later I moved to ActionScript 3, which is pretty similar to C#, so later it helped me quickly get started with Unity. I made driving games, action games, shooting, strategy, puzzle management, and so on. It was all about constant learning and experimentation. So I kept at it and eventually started selling games as sponsorships and making a tiny bit more money as I got better. Over the course of 5 years, I made roughly 35 games and learned a ton. However, it was still nowhere near enough to support a basic life. At its highest, I was making something like $300 a month. Even while living in Portugal, that's still a pretty low wage. However, it was a lot more than the 50 cents that I got for my first game, but again, still not enough. Then in July of 2012, Steam announced Greenlight, and at the time I didn't pay too much attention and just kept making Flash games, but it stayed in the back of my head. So in December of that year, after making a couple more games that still didn't get me minimum wage, I started thinking of making a game to put on Steam. This was also when I started doing my research looking for how I could build a PC desktop game. Flash could technically do it, but it wasn't really ideal. So during my research, that's when I found out about Unity. It ran on C#, which I had used for a bit and was very similar to ActionScript 3. It was capable of making builds for PC, Mac, and Linux. It was used by a large community, and it had a free version. So with all of that, it instantly became my choice. I downloaded Unity, started playing around with it, and found it very capable and pretty easy to use. Now, before Greenlight, Steam was a very closed-off system. Essentially, you had to know someone and have a top-tier game to be able to even get a chance of getting on Steam. Now, the good thing about that system was if you did get on there, you would essentially have guaranteed success, and all the games on the store had a very high quality bar. The bad thing was that very few people could get in, even if you had a very good game that would be perfect for a tiny niche. So thankfully, with Greenlight, it suddenly became possible to get on Steam, and with all that I learned from making Flash games for 5 years, I grabbed that chance. Again, Flash games were a wonderful learning experience for me, but not really profitable. At its best, I wasn't even getting anywhere near minimum wage. So it was a great learning experience, but in order to make it from free games with ads, you really need millions of players. Whereas with a paid game, you can get by if you just find a niche and make a game specifically for those players. So I thought about what type of game I would like to make that would be played with a mouse and keyboard on a PC desktop. One of the game series that I loved as a kid was SWAT. I loved the tactics and the theme of cops versus robbers, with a focus on trying to arrest people rather than just shoot everyone. So when I thought of making something mouse-based, it immediately came to my mind. The goal was to make a 2D top-down SWAT game where you would control a group of officers and arrest bad guys inside of a house. However, back then I was still very inexperienced, so when making the AI for the SWAT guys to line up behind the door, kick the door, throw a flashbang and enter, that complex scenario made me realize that I still didn't have anywhere near enough knowledge in order to be able to do that just yet. And then I also came across a design problem that I had no idea to solve, which is what led me to change direction. The one thing that I love most about SWAT games was going non-lethal and getting the bad guys to comply. One of the ways to do that is to shoot them in the leg, and sometimes they would comply after that. However, in a top-down perspective, that's not really a possibility. You can't really aim at different body parts. So the issues with complex AI and the inability to target body parts caused me to reconsider the whole concept. I still really like the top-down perspective, so I wanted to keep that. One of the last Flash games that I did that I really love was Cobra Team Heart Attack. It was a top-down zombie shooter with lots of polish and lots of effects. So that essentially made me think to switch from a SWAT game to a zombie game. Zombies have much simpler AI, so that part would be solved, and the characters would be completely controlled by the player without much need for some really complex AI. So I got to work on that concept, learning Unity as I went along, and 6 months later I had the very first version of what eventually became Survivor Squad. I still think it's a really great concept nowadays, with controlling the survivors and making sure they are positioned in the right direction. I really love the field of view mechanic, which by the way I did cover in a video on this channel. But back then you also needed tons of votes in order to get through Greenlight. So when Survivor Squad was done, the only place I could really sell it was still just on the website. Now the result of selling an obscure indie game in its own website is exactly as you would guess, which is pretty close to 0 copies. That was quite a bummer. I spent those 6 months giving it my all, but sadly I couldn't find the people that would enjoy the game. But the Greenlight page was still active and they were approving about 100 games every 2 weeks. So I started doing the math and realized that I would eventually get enough to get approved. The people in the comments enjoyed the concept and the game had a nice proportion of yes votes. So I went back to work, kept working and improving the game while the votes kept coming in every day. Eventually, it was around October, and when I finally got enough votes and the game was accepted onto Steam. I kept working on it and reading all the Steam documentation in order to add the achievements and prepare the store page and everything else that was needed. That was a ton of work and required me to learn a ton of new skills. Then finally, in November 8th, the game finally came out. So the idea that started nearly 1 year before finally came to pass. I transitioned from making Flash games with ads in order to making a premium Steam game. Now, thankfully, the game actually sold quite well at launch, especially when compared to my Flash games, which even when they are played by hundreds of thousands of people, that's not really worth much money. Here, with a couple of hundred copies, I was already making a lot more than with any other Flash game I had made. For example, my most successful Flash game was Corp. It was played over 6 million times, however, that really only generated about $1,000. Survivor Squad, on the other hand, made more than that on its first day on Steam alone, thanks to just selling a handful of copies. Back then, Steam was still in transition, so a lot of people were still very interested in every game that was coming out, so a game which seemed to have some unique mechanics appealed to quite a bit of people. However, there was also a lot of criticism. People thought the mechanics were unique, but the execution was lacking in many places, and that is very much accurate. I managed to apply all of my knowledge at the time and build a full game, but I still had a lot more to learn. Looking back, I still very much like the mechanics, but I think it's clearly made by someone inexperienced. So, since it sold well at launch, after thinking of what to do next, I eventually decided on a sequel. I still like the core mechanics, and I wanted to improve everything in every way. So I got to work on what eventually became Survivor Squad Gauntlets. I worked on it for a lot longer than Survivor Squad, in total around 18 months, and I even experimented with something new, which was Early Access. The game launched in Early Access, and sadly, despite being better in every way, it did not do well at all. Sales were about 10% of what Survivor Squad sold. I was still committed to making the game great, so during Early Access there were updates every single week for the 6 months I was on there. Sadly, for every update that I made, it was like screaming into a void. Despite my dedication and hard work, I never really managed to get the word out. I kept working on it, hoping that if I just focused on making the game great, it would eventually sell on the full release. However, that was not the case. The full release came and not much really changed. Copies sold were still very near zero. It really hurts me even now because I genuinely love the game. It has the same unique core mechanics of Survivor Squad whilst being better in every way. I think the game as a whole is awesome and I think it's full of potential. The map editor alone is like a programming language. It has so many capabilities, it's really insane. I still really like the game to this day, but sadly I could not find enough people who share in that desire. So this was my very first taste of a pretty serious failure. I worked like crazy for 18 months and the result was almost nothing. That is the danger of being an indie developer. If you don't sell copies, you don't make any money and suddenly you can't afford rent. There's no inherent safety net, no guaranteed minimum paycheck. If you sell zero, you get zero, regardless of how many hours or how hard you worked. Thankfully, I've always been pretty good with money, so I didn't overspend when I found success with Survivor Squad, which let me endure the financial failure that was Gauntlets. However, I also certainly didn't have enough in order to handle another 18-month failure. So after that, I started to think really hard about what the next best approach would be. The main limitation was time. I couldn't afford even just 1 year. But obviously, I also didn't want to make any trash, so I wanted a game that was short, sweet, and cheap. In thinking about all the various options, eventually I looked at my Flash games and one of them had become massively successful over time. Corp by then had over 6 million plays. That's a very insane number. However, again, most of those views came from a version that was sold to a sponsor. So all in all, those 6 million plays that I made in other websites with ads amounted to a total of just under $1,000. But the design of the game was very solid and a lot of people really liked it. So it seemed like the perfect fit for something short and sweet. I decided to remake Corp to work as a full desktop PC game and add a bunch of improvements for a nice cheap price. Over 3 months, I completely remade the game from scratch in Unity and added a ton of improvements and fixes thanks to all of the comments on the Flash version. I decided to rename it to Corp DX for the deluxe version. Since the core of the game was mostly the same as the free version, I knew I couldn't charge much, so I came up with a price of just $3. So it's more than free, but it's still a very low amount. Based on how many people play the free Flash version, I was hoping there would be enough people who would be able to pay such a small amount and that would make the game profitable. Now thankfully, I was actually right. The core of the game was very solid and all of the improvements I made and the benefits of running it in Unity instead of Flash were very noticeable. The game sold very well at launch and as the reviews kept being very positive, it kept selling well for quite a while. So this game that took roughly 3 months to make quickly became more profitable than Gauntlets, which took 18 months to make. Again, it still saddens me that Gauntlets did so badly, but that's what being an indie dev is all about. Sometimes you make it and sometimes you don't. Now, despite the very low price on the game, there were actually a bunch of negative reviews essentially saying that the game is great, but don't buy it and play the free version instead. These always struck me as very odd. So here are some people saying they generally like the game, but also they want to make sure that the developer doesn't get anything at all. So that seems very odd to me, but anyways, that's a topic for another time. Since Corp did so well, I thought afterwards I should stick with the same genre. I didn't want to do something completely different and risk getting the sad failure that ended up being Gauntlets. So I thought about what other themes I could explore in the tycoon genre. I explored a bunch of concepts, and the one that I really landed on was some sort of medieval army supplier. So you would get a contract saying we need 100 wooden swords, then you would build up your land with factories and workers in order to make the swords and deliver them. As I worked on it, I found that the system I devised for building the final items was great and I kept iterating on it. As I went along, it became clear that the medieval army supplier theme was being very limiting. I could only design items that fit the mold, so swords, shields, armors, and so on. After working on it for quite a while, I dropped that theme and just embraced the blueprints. So now it was simply make these blueprints that take some simple items and create a complex item. Without the medieval theme, I could then explore a lot more items. The result of that prototyping and adapting to where the design worked eventually turned into Blueprint Tycoon. Now in terms of sales, the game did quite alright. Not bad at all, but certainly not a hit. The game was extremely appealing to a very specific audience. Those who bought it mostly really liked it, but the concept screenshots and the trailer only attracted some very specific people. So it was successful, but only within its niche. There were also several reviews regarding complexity. So with regards to Corp, I got a bunch of reviews saying that the game was way too simplistic and needed more depth. And then with Blueprint Tycoon, I got lots of reviews saying it was way too complex and needed to be a lot more simple. So that really just goes to show you that you can never build the perfect game. Some people like more simple games, some people like more complex games. You have to accept that not everyone will like your games because each person is looking for a different experience. Then after Blueprint Tycoon came one of my most ambitious games with really interesting results. With the success of Corp and Blueprint Tycoon, coupled with the fact that I don't really spend much money, meant that I was feeling like I could attempt something a bit more risky. I've never really played much on consoles as a kid, most of my time was done on my computer. The only console I had was a PlayStation, so I never really had that connection that some people have specifically with consoles. But still, as a game developer, the idea of having my games working on a professional console does sound very nice. So when I was thinking of what to do next, I started to really focus on making something that could eventually work on a console. So that means making a game based on a gamepad, which pretty much removes tycoons as a possibility. So the genre that makes most sense on a gamepad is action. So I started prototyping some character movement. But I didn't want to make just a simple action game, I wanted it to be very fast. That made me experience with various dashes, which got me thinking about making some abilities. Then I also didn't just want a generic action game, I knew I wanted something original to make the game stand out. So that's when I started thinking about action mixed with strategy. One of my favorite games is Mountain Blade, so that became my guiding idea. Make a game with nice and fast-paced action with dashes and skills, plus the ability to raid castles and control your army. That way it would be unique and fully controllable with a gamepad. The end result of all of that is Hyper Knights. Now in terms of the results, Hyper Knights was an interesting one. In total development time, it was around 14 months and spent 6 months in early access. I also invested heavily into professional artwork in order to make the game really stand out. So it took quite a while to make and I invested a pretty large amount onto it. In terms of reviews, it was the best game that I've done. The review score stayed above 90 for a very long time. However, in terms of sales, it was simply decent. Not terrible, but not great. Given how much time I spent and how much money I invested, the end result was just a very basic wage. That really saddened me quite a bit. I really liked the game, and the reviews all seemed to agree, however despite that, sales never really came. Since those sales never came, it caused me to again focus on what went wrong and how I can improve for the future. So that idea of making a game and later porting it to consoles still hasn't come to pass. I'd certainly like to, but spending the time to focus on that potentially risky endeavor is really something I can't afford at the moment. Hyper Knights and its somewhat failure despite being a great game is what caused me to really look long and hard at how Steam works. Why is it that a game with positive reviews and low price doesn't seem to find an audience? Since then, I've spent countless hours reading everything I can find regarding Steam and indie game marketing, analyzing games that make it and games that don't. And through that, I've managed to learn quite a ton. I've made 2 videos covering what you should do before and after release on Steam in order to get the best chances for success. So check those out if you're in the process of launching your own game or just want to know more about releasing on Steam. So I learned a ton and also did some experiments. Now, one of the reasons why Hyper Knights wasn't financially successful was just because of how much I spent on it, both in time and money. So my next game would be an experiment into code reusability and an interesting game with no marketing behind it. The end result was Hyper Knights Battles. It's an interesting game, it's clearly just an experiment, it's more of a sandbox than a clearly defined game. It's great if you're a programmer and like building characters and AI, but that's a very small niche. So with that game, I learned that even if you manage to spend very little making the game, if it's not well received and there's no marketing, then you will still fail to make a profit. So with that in mind, I started to focus really hard on what game could I make that would have an easy time with marketing. Also, my most successful games were tycoons, so I should stick with that. A big part of marketing is really just having a very compelling concept. Now for a tycoon game, the theme is very integral to how it works. Now the reason you play Prison Architect is because of the uniqueness of managing a prison. Unless you go for the more generic tycoons like building a city, then there isn't much direct competition. I obviously cannot hope to compete with SimCity or Cities Skylines, so I have to go with a unique route. And with that, I came up with a very unique and interesting concept. A tycoon with ninjas called Ninja Tycoon. The name itself is already a lot more marketable than Hyper Knights Battles, and the concept sounds interesting and unique. So that was part of the plan, make it a unique and interesting concept and name. Part 2 was based on my research of Steam and that wishlists and first week sales were very important, so I started spreading the word as soon as I could in order to gather some wishlists. And part 3 of the plan was to make it short and sweet. I didn't want to spend 1 year, which would make it very much more difficult in order to be profitable. With all of that, the game launched, and it was actually a pretty nice success given how long and how little I spent on it. The wishlist helped ensure a decent number of sales on the first week, and it got a nice click-through rate whenever the game showed up. However, the negative thing of spending such a small amount of time working on the game is that it is obviously very limited and very small. The experience is great and interesting, but it only lasts for a couple of hours. So that really means that the experiment was a success. I now understood better what makes a game sell, and all I needed was to apply that to a game with a lot more content. So once again, I started prototyping some ideas and thinking heavily about how marketable they were. I wanted to stick with Tycoon since that's the genre that I found most success in, and one that is also very much appealing to a decently sized niche audience of the Steam audience. As I worked on various prototype ideas, I started playing around with the idea of arenas and an AI. So essentially having some units fight each other. At the same time, I kept thinking about marketing. Battle Royale games were a huge thing, and they still are, so when the prototype with the arenas started to take shape, it became quite clear. I was going to make a Tycoon game like Roller Coaster Tycoon, but with shooting arenas, and I was going to name it Battle Royale Tycoon. So I kept working on it, and in December of 2018, after 6 months of development, the game was released into early access. Again, I focused on applying everything I've learned, so I set up the coming soon page as soon as possible and started gathering wishlists. The game had almost 10,000 wishlists when launched, and that helped it have a nice healthy launch. Then in several months in early access, I did a ton of updates, improved lots of areas, and continued to work on it. I've also done several videos covering systems from the game. One of the reasons I started this channel was to make tutorials that had an actual practical application instead of just theory. So in those videos, I cover pretty much the exact same code that I used on the game. Something really great you can do is go play the game on Steam, see it all in action, then come back here and check out the videos to see how the underlying systems work. Then last September, the game finally came out of early access and it has done quite well. I covered all the stats in detail in another video, so check the link in the description if you haven't seen it yet. In there I cover how much the game sold and how it went. So if you're keeping count at home, that was a ton of random games and random programming over my childhood, which gave me a nice knowledge base. Then 35 Flash games, which gave me a lot of game dev learning experience, but never really any serious income. And then 8 Steam games. 2 that failed hard, 3 that did well, and 3 that did great. So as you can see, this has been a very long journey with lots of ups and downs over many years. Overall, I'm pleased with where I'm at right now and look forward to the future, but always constantly learning on how to do better. This is a really tough business, and in order to make it, it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of persistence. So if you want to follow along with this path, then do keep that in mind. By all means, do follow your dream, but be aware of what it takes to get there. I made a video where I covered 7 clear steps to become a game developer, so check that out if you're looking for more specific practical advice. This video took a real long time to make, so if you can, please hit the like button and share it with a friend. You can also pick up the game bundle on the website and play the games for yourself. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video, which has been quite different from my usual step-by-step tutorials. If you're new here, consider subscribing and check out all the videos I've done, which will help you build whatever you want in Unity. Post any questions you have in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. This video is made possible thanks to these awesome supporters. Go to patreon.com/unitycodemonkey to get some perks and help keep the videos free for everyone. Alright, I'll see you next time.